So welcome, Jennifer Blanke, Senior Advisor to Whiteshield Partners and former Vice President of the African Development Bank. It's a pleasure to have you here today to discuss the Global Labor Resilience Index 2021, which is being launched as we speak. And we have a few questions to you related to Africa and labor market resilience in the wider African continent. One of the things that we see from the results of the Global Labor Resilience Index is a great disparity in results between countries in labor market resilience. And it would be good to have your insights as to what might explain these disparities between countries.
Well, if you look at, and thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here and excited to be involved in this project. I think if you think about resilience and labor market resilience, you might think that basic resilience in African countries is quite high because there are no social safety nets in countries. People just have to work to survive. Almost everybody's doing some sort of work, and many of them living on less than $2 a day. They don't have a luxury not to work. But the majority of Africans do not have sufficient training, education, and find themselves mainly in low-paid, informal jobs. Many of them living on less than $2 a day, little security, and this is something that is extremely precarious. So if you take the broader perspective that's measured by the index, it's perhaps not surprising to see that on average, the region is measured as having actually the world's least resilient labor markets, with most African countries sort of populating the lower parts of the ranking. Now, of course, this average masks some significant differences within the region. So, for example, if you look at the small island economies of Mauritius and the Seychelles, they rank quite a bit higher. Also, Botswana is a bit higher. And this is because they have much stronger educational systems that are preparing young people for the jobs of the future, at least doing a better job of that. Also, these are countries that are quite open to trade and tourism, and that provides for a more dynamic jobs market. And also such middle-income countries are better able to provide at least basic elements of a social safety net. And that's important for resilience over the longer term. So if you get into the details of individual countries in specific areas, you see that Africa already has leaders in aspects of labor market resilience that can be shared and built upon across the region. In other words, Africa can learn a great deal from Africa, and that is quite encouraging.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. Now, of course, we talk a lot about longer-term challenges for the African continent, which go beyond labor market resilience, including a reduction of poverty, economic diversification, intra-regional trade, and all that. Now, question to you regarding more short-term priorities. If we look at the next, let's say, 12 months, what do you think some of the countries in Africa could do to enhance their labor market resilience?
So, if you think about the COVID crisis, which is what has gotten us where we are right now, it's had a major impact around the world, and obviously Africa has not been spared. And in fact, African governments were already strapped for resources before it, even just to, manage to provide basic public services. And now, since the pandemic hit, their coffers are really emptied. Just in dealing with the short-term management of the crisis. So the truth of the matter is that African governments face a major resource challenge, and they cannot simply roll out big stimulus efforts like we're seeing in places like Europe and the US. There's no silver bullet for Africa, but there are some concrete steps that can be taken to improve labor market resilience that might not be too costly in the short term, and that might have an impact on the longer term by taking steps now. I think the most important is really to get young people back to school, especially girls. Who have missed out on so much of the year due to school closures. There's no such thing as virtual schooling in Africa. We've been able to do that in some other parts of the world, but in Africa it just doesn't work. So you can imagine how devastating the impact is being for exacerbating inequalities that were already there. So there's a real danger that many of these young people, many of these girls will never go back to school after this hiatus, and it will be critical to get them back in school, because otherwise it will be devastating for their ability to fully participate in the jobs market in the future. And really, from a governance perspective, it would stunt future growth, as well as simply getting kids back in school. And although it's a bit of a longer term priority, governments really should take advantage of this global shock as a reset opportunity to review their educational curricula. And in consultation with the private sector, so that at least has a sense of what is needed now in the jobs market. It's well known in Africa, as in many parts of the world, that many of the things that young people are learning in schools are simply not helpful for the skills that they need in the future. They're outdated, especially given how quickly the labor market is changing. Many young people need to be focusing much more on things like engineering, mathematics, technology, and including coding, so that they can benefit also from the opportunities that the digital world is bringing. And finally, I think I would mention sort of entrepreneurial training, still in the educational area. That's really important for people in Africa, and especially young people, so that good ideas can become sustainable businesses. There are simply not enough high quality jobs around for Africans right now. And so they need to create a lot of their own jobs and jobs for their peers in order to improve employment opportunities, while also providing, of course, many goods and services to Africans that don't exist, that are not, sort of made in the region right now. Right now, really, it's so critical because the median age in Africa is about 19. Africa is super young. They have great ingenuity, and if their talents are unleashed, they can really improve the region's labor market resilience. But governments have to move faster to foster a demographic dividend rather than a demographic disaster. And that's what we're really talking about right now. So education, 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 and the right kind of education.
Right, clear. And actually the disconnect that you mentioned between the educational system, the curriculum, and the needs of the future markets is not only touching the African continent, but actually most continents in the world based on the results of the Global Labor Resilience Index. So this is a global challenge, we can say. Now, if we turn to the longer term challenges, this was more previously about shorter term. We took longer term, so we're looking at 5 years and beyond. Where do you think the African countries should be investing to sustain resilience in the longer term?
Well, I think obviously they'll have to be working on the educational and entrepreneurial efforts on a regular basis that are already underway, because although some improvements would be made over the shorter term, this is something that needs to be fully overhauled and reviewed regularly to ensure relevance. So it's not something that they can feel like they've done and then they can move on. And actually here, just like you just said, I really think that Africa is in a way at an advantage because there's less legacy infrastructure and vested interests that we see in many other parts of the world, which means Africa can learn from the mistakes that were made in other parts of the world and build things correctly, the right kinds of systems, the right kind of educational system, entrepreneurial systems from the get-go. Now, as well as the education system, which obviously I care a lot about, financial systems are also really important and they need to follow. Basically, they need to be greatly developed and deepened in order to support entrepreneurship in the region. Good ideas are one thing, but if you don't have the financing to do something with them, you're not going to get very far. So, we need to find ways to finance young people and women in Africa that have good ideas, but they often don't have access to traditional bank finance, which is really kind of the source of funding for most businesses in Africa, because they have different collateral profiles. A young person will go to a bank in Africa and say, I have this great idea, I'd like a loan. And they say, well, can we have your last 20 years of tax returns? Well, how are they going to do that? They're only 25 years old. So, things like this, really looking at ways to unleash the creation of good jobs and good businesses. And then finally, I think I would turn to trade, which is really important. And that is focused on quite a bit in the index. I'm very excited about the potential of the new African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is just in the process of being rolled out now. It can make a huge difference to Africa's economic performance and labor market resilience if it is fully harnessed. Africa trades very little with each other. The countries basically are trading externally and hardly at all with each other. And they need to do this if their industries are to achieve the kind of economies of scale that are needed for cross-border value chains, right? That will then drive the higher value-added jobs and activities and businesses that Africa so desperately needs. So if African countries really work together towards this goal, working through the new free trade agreement, obviously together with the existing, regional efforts, we should expect better jobs and greater labor market resilience in the future. But, this is a big if. They really need to work together and make this happen, because all these little economies are going to continue to struggle, and all these little tiny labor markets are going to continue to struggle. If you want true resilience, you need to expand.
Excellent. Yes. So Jennifer, you mentioned trade, and it's a very important issue because it's not necessarily traditionally associated with labor markets. And it highlights that the Global Labor Resilience Index is structured around it has a structural pillar and a policy pillar. And the structural pillar incorporates elements such as diversification of trade, which can take longer for countries. And intra-regional trade is indeed, I believe, less than 20% in the African continent compared to 2/3 of trade in, let's say, Europe, for instance. So there's a long way to go there in intra-regional trade. Another aspect of trade is higher value added, moving up the value chain, which was also highlighted in this year's index. What would you see as opportunities for African countries to move up the value chain and therefore create better, higher quality jobs?
So, and actually, even just to add to what you said about trade within the region, I mean, not only does Africa trade very little among itself, but it's the only region that trades less with itself than with other regions, which just shows you how huge this opportunity is if the economies are grown. So, I mean, I'm passionate about food. And food systems. And it's not surprising because I've worked on this a lot in the past. So I truly believe that the food and agriculture sector represents a huge opportunity in this transition. Right now, as we know, most Africans, I mean, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, but really across Africa, work in farming. And yet Africa imports a huge amount of processed food. Something like $50 billion net per year, and it's going up every year. And this is because farming's not productive. In some places, it's really at pre-industrial levels. If you look around, you see people still kind of farming with handheld hoes and things like that. So there's a huge opportunity for really increasing, productivity, because Africa should not be importing so much food. It doesn't make any sense. Africa should be helping the world to solve the world's food crisis. It has, more unused arable land than any other part of the world. And by some estimates, the African Development Bank thinks that it will be a $3 trillion market by 2030. So just think about the potential. And yet all they're doing right now is basically exporting raw materials and importing back the finished goods, which means that they're exporting jobs to places like Europe and the US. It doesn't make sense. So I think, what needs to happen is that the farming sector needs to be mechanized. You need to get the best technologies out to the farms and then move people into higher value added jobs working in processing for the food that Africans are buying, but they should be buying it from Africa. So I think, this for me is a no-brainer. And I truly believe that Africa's industrialization will in large part come from agro-industrialization. There's a huge, huge opportunity there, huge market, and a lot of really good ideas already in Africa. Now, that's probably the big piece, but I would be remiss not to mention also the fact that Africa has a real competitive advantage in renewable energy. And that is also a sector for the future. It has abundant sun, wind year round. And so this is another area where Africa has huge potential if focused on the right area and making sure you have the right skills and financing, et cetera, to work in there, to create more sustainable pathways for growth, but also great jobs. And given that so many Africans still don't have access even to basic electricity, imagine the opportunities here. So, overall, in keeping with the electricity theme, I do truly believe that Africa's future is bright, and all that is needed is to unleash its incredible talent, and especially the talent of young people and women in Africa.
If I may, I'd like to come back to your example of agriculture, because let's take the case of cocoa, which is dominated by, I believe, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. Actually, on global markets, they have more than 50% of global markets in cocoa production. And for, let's say, more than 40 years, we've been talking about moving up the value chain in the cocoa sector. And yet they continue to export pretty much raw cocoa to the big multinationals, which then refine this cocoa in Switzerland. I believe that's the country of residence, the Nestle's of this world, etc. What's going on here? What can be done to turn the tables around and stop this trend and have a kind of reinvestment into the African continent?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of politics involved in this sector, but you really put your finger on it. The issue with the cocoa sector, which is one of my obsessions in Africa, because it's got such huge potential, is that although Africa is exporting like 80%, I think those two countries that you're talking about basically account for 60% of all cocoa exported in the whole world. Basically, Africa has no piece of the chocolate market. And so if you look, and if you think about value added, you know, as a continuum, unfortunately, these countries are very low on the value chain. And I mean, part of it is because even if you talk about the two biggest producers, they have very different structures to their markets, and they have different sort of needs to support farmers and support incomes. But what this ends up doing is basically reducing competitiveness over time. And in the meantime, you're seeing other regions who are moving in and able to perhaps, you know, move up the value chain. So I think, you know, this is again where trade is going to become really critical, and also the skills, but also a mindset change. Somehow I've heard people say in the past, in my lifetime, Africa will never produce chocolate. First of all, they do already, and some really good chocolate. But, you know, it's about saying, we don't believe that that's all we can do. It's about basically moving the bar up and then harnessing things like the free trade agreement, the regional trade agreements, making sure that countries work together, because a lot of what is needed, for example, is to have safe places to store, kind of bank things like cocoa. You need to have production and phytosanitary standards that allow you to be exporting elsewhere. And I would also say, remember, cocoa doesn't only produce chocolate. It also, you can do many things with it, lotion, many great things with cocoa butter. So thinking really innovatively about what other things can be done that maybe are at a lower bar in terms of phytosanitary, but that can be done as countries move up the value chain. And I think to a large extent, often countries just don't hold the bar up enough, and their young people, they will figure this stuff out. And especially if they work together with some of the big players that you're talking about to ensure that it can't continue like this forever. You know, at some point people will rebel, you know, because they will figure out that, you know, they're picking the cocoa beans and they're living like in a certain way, and their kids and the big producers, they're living in a different way. And I think, you know, these sort of inequalities, it's exactly what the index is trying to show. This is the sort of thing that we need to do away with, because it is true that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not, and that's what we have to fix.
Thank you, Jennifer Blanke, for all these insights on the African continent and how to improve labor market resilience. And we're looking forward to actually implementing some of these policy recommendations that you suggest.
Great. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.